Bom dia a todos e todas. Eu queria dar as boas-vindas à professora Connell, em nome da ANPOCS, e a todos vocês. Eu vou fazer uma introdução muito breve, acho que levaria muito tempo para fazer uma introdução completa do trabalho da professora Connell, um trabalho de longo curso, uma trajetória quase que totalmente voltada à reflexão das relações de poder. A professora Connell, socióloga da Universidade de Sydney, inicia sua trajetória com uma reflexão sobre a dinâmica da estrutura de classes na Austrália. A partir dessa primeira reflexão, desenvolve um estudo sobre gênero, sobre as relações e hierarquias de gênero, com uma ênfase forte nos estudos sobre masculinidade. De fato, uma das fundadoras desse campo, né, dos Men's Studies, dos estudos sobre masculinidade no plano internacional. É um prazer recebê-la aqui e, imediatamente, bom, além de dedicada à reflexão teórica, a professora Connell tem uma trajetória também no ativismo, no feminismo, fez consultorias para a Unesco, para a ONU, enfim, tem uma trajetória ampla, não só na reflexão acadêmica, mas também no ativismo em relação à igualdade de gênero e, enfim, as lutas por igualdade de um modo geral. Bom, eu passo imediatamente a palavra para a professora.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honoured to be asked, and I hope I can make good return by telling you an interesting story and introducing you to some people who may be new to you. I have a dramatic title, The Coming Revolution in Social Theory. It's almost serious. And like all good dramas, it comes in three parts. In the first part, I want to talk about the crisis in the system, in this case, the system of knowledge, which is the social sciences today. In the second part, I want to talk about the revolutionary force, which may solve the crisis. And in the third part, I want to talk about the nature of the intellectual revolution that's involved and some of the practicalities of change. So that's the order in which I hope to tell my story. Like all good academics, I will start with a definition. What is theory? What are we talking about when we talk about theory? And my starting point is to say that theory is a form of work. It is part of an intellectual labour process in which bodies of knowledge are shaped. It's a specific part of a larger intellectual labour process. It's the part in which data, information, raw materials of different kinds are sorted, organised, and indeed imagined, because theory always involves going beyond the immediately given to some kind of larger structure of meaning. So I think therefore of theory as embedded in a process of intellectual labour. And this requires me then to think industrially about theory and indeed about social science. To think industrially about the labour of theory making, the labour of making theory. This requires a workforce. It involves a labour process, and it requires institutions in which the labour can happen and the workforce can be organised and deployed. And my first illustration, if I can make the technology work. Yes. Is a famous and pioneering example of a knowledge institution in the social sciences. This is the social science building at the University of Chicago, built in the 1920s for the specific purpose of housing the development of social scientific knowledge about what was then North America's second biggest and most turbulent city. And guess who provided the money? Rockefeller. It's true. So, a pioneering moment in the development of modern social science, and we have many more knowledge institutions, of course, today. Thinking globally, and not just thinking in Chicago, about the labour process of social science, we have to recognise a global division of labour in the intellectual labour process. This concept I take from the work of Pauline Huntonji, a philosopher from Benin in West Africa, the country formerly known as Dahomey, under French colonial rule. Huntonji is, in my opinion, one of the most important philosophers in the world. He's not well known outside Africa. But one of the things he has done is to develop a kind of global political economy of knowledge in which he argues that the global system of knowledge in many ways maps the material and service economy that is mapped on a world scale by economists such as Samir Amin, whom many of you will know for his work on accumulation on a world scale. Huntonji's argument is a kind of epistemological version of this concept of a global accumulation process in science. He argues that in the global periphery, the colonised world, under colonialism and under post-colonial power, the principal knowledge process is the collection of data. The colonised world has long, for hundreds of years, served as a data mine for European and North American science, in natural sciences as well as in social sciences. And there are many examples of that. If you read practically any history of a scientific area such as biology, astronomy, and for that matter, sociology, you'll see the importance of data collection in the colonised world. Think, for instance, of Charles Darwin, who spent years as a young man travelling in the colonised and post-colonial world, collecting data about the geology of South America, about birds in the Galapagos Islands, about coral reefs in the Pacific, then took it back to England, processed it conceptually, and there was the theory of evolution. So data collection in the colonised world is actually a crucial part of the history of scientific knowledge in the global metropole. But what happens in the metropole is somewhat different. There is, of course, data collection also in the metropole. But crucially, what happens in the metropole is the moment of theory. The conceptual processing of data, the sorting, the organising of data, the imagining of relationships between pieces of data, and thus the creation of theory. And in a third step in the global political economy of knowledge, science is re-exported to the global periphery, to the colonised or post-colonial world, in the form of theoretical packages, in the form of methods, and above all, in the form of applied science, agronomy, technologies, transport technologies and so forth, and social technologies too, of administration, data collection such as the census, and various applications of the social sciences in social practice. So the core of Huntonji's argument, and I think he is actually quite right about this, is that the global division of labour in the production and circulation of knowledge crucially locates the moment of theory in the global metropole, data collection and application in the global periphery. And that is something that really should give us, as social scientists, a lot to think about, because that is also true in our disciplines of the social sciences. And if you look at the history of theory in the social sciences, basically what is happening in the construction of social theory is the building of theory out of northern social experience, out of the experience of the societies of the global metropole, the former imperial powers for hundreds of years, and then the centre of the global economy in our post-colonial time. Sometimes the northern experience that is theorised is a northern experience of encounter with societies of the global south, and that of course constitutes the discipline of anthropology as we know it, but in sociology, economics, political science and other social science disciplines, the main experience being conceptualised and imagined is the social experience of the societies where the theorists live, Western Europe and North America, and nowhere else. Now what we have here, if you think about this globally, is theory that is constructed from a position of power in the global social order. And if you think about the arguments of people like Aníbal Quijano about the coloniality of power, you can see that this involves a coloniality of knowledge as well, embedded deeply in the social sciences, so deeply that it is almost invisible in the texts of the main theorists. When we read Bourdieu or Habermas, we do not see them saying, I am theorising from the global north. But that is in fact what they are doing. And what is common to all social science theorising from the global north, and we find this in Marx, in Bourdieu, in Antonio Negri, in all the celebrated theorists whom we study and use. They are theorising a society without external determinations because they are theorising from the centre of global power. No one has colonised them, no one is controlling them, and they are free to imagine social systems, discursive processes which are not determined from outside the social formation that they are imagining from. But when we go to the global periphery, and remember that always that the global periphery is where the majority of the world's population live. 4/5, 5/6 of the world's population live outside the metropole. When we go to the global periphery, things are different. It's not possible to theorise societies in the global periphery as autonomous, as independent of external determinations. On the contrary, theorists, social thinkers in the periphery have a strong consciousness of the importance of external determinations in the society they are talking about and in the intellectual tools that they have. This is called by Pauline Huntonji extraversion. It's a useful concept. By that he doesn't mean the psychological concept due to Jung, but it's a concept in epistemology where knowledge is constructed with reference to sources of authority outside your own social situation, outside your own society. So Huntonji argues that the characteristic attitude of intellectual workers in the global periphery is one of extraversion, orientation to the concepts, to the knowledge production process in the global periphery as our source of authority, methods, theories, concepts, and so forth. Now, this concept arises in many other parts of the global periphery. When I first read Huntonji writing from West Africa, I really shivered. It was so uncanny to recognise in writing from Africa the experience of intellectuals in Australia. Because a similar debate has occurred without Huntonji's precision in Australia about what in Australia is called the cultural cringe, the kind of bowing down to the cultural authority of the European metropole. And we can find the same kind of debate in many other parts of the world. A classic example, I think, comes from Iran in the work of a writer. No, I'm not succeeding here. Ali Ahmad, a novelist, short story writer, social commentator, religious critic, all of those in Iran in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. Ali Ahmad published in the early 1960s a wonderful book called in Farsi, it's the only word in Farsi I know, Garbzadegi, which is translated in about 10 different ways into English. The best translation I know is the word Westoxication, being intoxicated with the West. And this was his name for the characteristic attitude of middle-class people in neo-colonial Iran to the cultural, economic, political authority of the global metropole. And his book, which was immediately banned by the Iranian regime at the time, though it became a bestseller later, is a lovely example of how this attitude flows through into all areas of social life. From the point of view of social scientists, and Ali Ahmad is a social commentator rather than a professional social scientist, but from the point of view of social scientists, extroversion means that we are constantly trying to theorize the experience and social relations of a society in the global periphery from concepts that were developed to describe a society in the metropole. And that, to my mind, always involves some kind of distortion, some kind of slippage in the representation of our realities. And most importantly, perhaps, it involves a methodological suppression of the specific history of colonised and post-colonial societies, because the history of colonisation and post-colonial situations is simply not constitutive for theorising which happens in the global metropole. Now, this situation which I'm describing is, what I'm saying is by no means original. I mean, many people have noticed this back to the 1960s and 1950s. This is a familiar problem, a set of problems. And naturally, therefore, there have been searches for alternatives, for other ways of grounding our knowledge of society. One of the alternatives, which has gained some traction in Australia recently, I know has some presence in Latin American discussions and has a great deal of power in Africa, is the concept of indigenous knowledge. The concept that there are knowledge systems which pre-existed colonialism, pre-existed the moment of colonisation, and therefore can be drawn upon as an intellectual resource for understanding the world from outside the metropole. Another possibility is the search for applications of a pre-colonial or anti-colonial stance in the contemporary moment. I mean, this is the approach which has been called decolonial thought in some recent discussions in the Americas. And you will be as familiar with this, I'm sure, as I am. I think I agree with José Mauricio Dominguez's critique of decolonial thought, that it very commonly involves a romanticization of pre-colonial knowledge systems. But it is valuable in naming the problem of coloniality in knowledge as something we have to grapple with, however we do that. And in other parts of the world, the project of trying to find alternative standpoints has moved into disciplinary knowledge in the social sciences in the attempt to find, so to speak, local sociologies or local political sciences. To give an example of this from my own discipline of sociology, a recently published book edited by Sujata Patel, a celebrated sociologist from India, and published by the International Sociological Association, which collects examples of national sociologies from different parts of the world in an assemblage which doesn't attempt to synthesize, really, but at least, again, names the issue and displays some of the materials with which we might begin to think differently. So that's my account, if you like, of the problem. What I think of as a knowledge system which is now in crisis in some sense because of its underlying inability to theorize the social experience of the majority of the world's people, however well the social sciences theorize the social experience of the global metropole. So I argue with the decolonial theorists that the colonial encounter itself is a crux for social science, that we must have social sciences that are capable of dealing with the colonial encounter and the continuing historical consequences of the colonial encounter for the construction of modern world society. And that, if you like, is the revolutionary force of my argument, theorizing from the colonial encounter in its historical depth and present. And I'm going just now to gesture at some of the consequences of taking this as a starting point for social theory, which will make a genuinely global social theory look different from the social theories constructed in the metropole. One thing that's different is in our understanding of time. Social theory in the global metropole typically works with a continuous, or at least intelligible, succession of time. You know, the feudal mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, the socialist mode of production, etc. I mean, these kinds of schemas and developmental plans are very familiar across the social sciences. But they don't work for the colonized. The experience of colonization, the creation of a society in colonialism, is not intelligible from the historical experience of the colonized before colonization. There is a disjunction in time, represented by the act of colonisation itself. And that disjunction is carried forward into colonial societies and post-colonial societies too. A second difference is about violence.